University and college students are back in the classroom this week for the winter term, and in Ontario, some have returned to new free speech policies mandated in August by the provincial government. Premier Doug Ford said colleges and universities had until January 1st to impose a policy or else face funding cuts. So did the schools meet this deadline, and do they think their policies will be effective? Linda Franklin is president and CEO of Colleges Ontario. She joins us in Toronto. And Gillian Phillips is the president of the Confederation of University Faculty Associations. She joins us via Skype from North Bay, Ontario. Hi to both of you. Thanks for being with us. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Franklin, I'll start with you. Ontario's 24 colleges do have a policy in place. Tell us a bit about it.
Sure. We were asked by the provincial government a few months ago to establish a freedom of speech policy for all post-secondary institutions. The colleges do a lot of work together as a system and felt that it would be in the best interests of everybody if there was some consistency in our policies. So we put together a team of experts, some academics from our senior leadership team, some student service representatives, representative from the College Student Alliance that represent 14 of our campuses for students, legal, and had a series of discussions and then put a draft policy statement together that then went to our presidents for review.
And what is the, if I could follow up, Ms. Franklin, what is the aim of the policy and sort of what is the challenge in crafting one that, still allows for free speech, but makes sure, that addresses, I guess, concerns around hate speech?
Sure. Well, in all honesty, it wasn't that challenging to do because we were able to build on work that had been done by others. The University of Chicago has a very good policy that's been in place for a while, is very well regarded. The University of Toronto has a policy that's been in place for 25 years. Yale has a policy in place. So we were able to draw on some good data and research there. And also, it was a pretty clear line of sight to us what had to be done. Obviously, the most important thing we had to say was that colleges are institutes of inquiry, that freedom of speech has to be an important philosophy of post-secondary institutions, and our policy would have to absolutely indicate that we would not shield people from opposing views they disagreed with, and that ability to see other points of view is critical to creative thinking. At the same time, as you mentioned, it's important not to allow hate speech on campuses. So if a speech could be considered to be in opposition to the Human Rights Code, for example, that would not be allowed on our campuses.
Ms. Phillips, where are universities at in the process?
Well, the university system is different from the college system insofar as the universities are each autonomous entities. And so each university is drafting, or has drafted, I would assume, its own free speech policy, which should be publicly available, as of January 1st. Now, I can't speak to where each of these policies is at because they are an individual university process. But I believe that most are drawing on, similar policies that already explicitly or implicitly help to provide a foundation for the very vibrant culture of free speech that currently exists on our campuses. Including inclusive speech, including attentiveness to that kind of spirit of debate and public inquiry, lines of inquiry that my colleague was referring to as well.
Ms. Phillips, let me follow up on that because, throughout the process, when the province first said, okay, we want to create these new standards, everyone has to have a policy, they threatened reductions to operating grant funding. They tied that to the idea of meeting those so-called standards, and you had issues with that at the time. What are your feelings about that now?
Yeah, I think we're deeply concerned. Faculty are deeply concerned at Ontario universities. We're already the least funded per student in Ontario across the country. Students receive the least amount of funding. Our universities receive the least amount of funding. We're already really struggling. Universities are struggling to provide, to provide full operations on their budgets. And so anything that threatens to cut or reduce funding further is deeply problematic because indeed such a measure only serves to put under threat the educational and research quality of our institutions, which are working really, really hard with very, very little. So this seems like a completely counterproductive maneuver of Ontario's faculty.
Ms. Franklin, do the colleges have any clarity about the draft policy that's being released? In that, does it measure up to what the provinces have said they want the standards to be? Has the province at all been clear about what would create the circumstances under which funding would be pulled, for example?
Yeah, no, we haven't had a conversation with the province about that, but the Higher Education Quality Council has been mandated to review these policies, to monitor them, to, over a period of a year, look at what has happened as a result of these policies being in place. And we have had a conversation with them. They seem, at least in the initial going, to be satisfied with what we've drafted across our system. So we feel pretty confident that this is going to serve us well and meet the requirements of the government.
Do you have any concerns about the government creating rules around free speech and threatening the withdrawal of funds related to them?
No. You know, I don't think the government is developing the rules around free speech. They've asked the institutions to do that. We've drawn on a good body of information that already exists. And I would agree with my colleague that there is already a culture of free speech on campuses. But, you know, a few years ago, we were asked by the Ontario government to establish a standalone sexual violence policy. And at the time, a lot of the elements of that policy were already embedded in other college policies. But it did help bring some clarity to the issue to have a standalone policy that was easy to access, easy to find for people who are in need of knowing that information. We see this in largely the same vein. A lot of policies around freedom of speech are already captured in institutional policies, but having some clarity of having all the information in one place is probably helpful. And in terms of funding, I mean, I would certainly agree that our post-secondary system is really challenged financially, has been for a number of years. Ontario is pretty much the least well-funded system in the country. But at the same token, you know, the province is already tying some funding to outcomes that it sees as requirements for post-secondary institutions. And I think we've tended to see this as aligned with that sort of idea. There are some outcomes we require of our post-secondary institutions that have public funding, and we'll want to make sure those outcomes are met. We haven't had any specific conversations on this policy, though.
Ms. Phillips, is there a point there that clarity is not a bad thing?
I think, well, to be perfectly frank, I think universities individually are clear, and I think one of the important things to keep in mind, again, about the university system is that each institution is autonomous, which means it has its own culture. I think the cultures are developed with the same end goals and the same values in mind. And I think being clear about values and goals is always useful to articulate that. But I think in terms of drafting the kind of policies that the government is wanting to see is worrisome insofar as it introduces the specter of discipline, especially against students. And I think one of the things that we're concerned about is that, in fact, a kind of standalone policy around this, which is tied to a punitive approach if that policy is violated, ends up chilling free speech on campus rather than encouraging it, rather than fostering it, so that student groups or faculty or staff end up being so concerned about the possibility of discipline that, in fact, they won't make those sort of engage in a vibrant community of debate and lively conversation. So, and I think to follow up on another point there, the government has signaled, and we've seen this, in previous governments as well, an interest in tying funding to indeed performance outcomes, to metrics. And we find this, again, a very worrisome trend because for a number of reasons, but it tends, the research has shown that it does not actually improve the quality of education at universities in other areas where it's done. And what happens is, in fact, resources get diverted. The sort of free flow of education and conversation and the focus on what's happening in the classroom with students and faculty becomes sidelined for meeting administrative targets. So we're really concerned about this trend, and indeed I agree that this is the beginning of that movement.
Quickly, though, just to play devil's advocate, Ms. Phillips, from the point of view of how much money is going towards post-secondary institutions, and I take both your points that about Ontario versus other places, but the idea of making sure as a government that you're getting value for your money, could that not be somewhat motivating the ask when it comes to outcomes, et cetera?
So, again, from our perspective, we have already got great value for money at Ontario University, right? Like, we actually have one of the best university systems, certainly in the country, possibly in the world. We educate thousands of students every year. We have highly trained and educated faculty. We have excellent classroom experiences and research going on, innovative research happening at our universities. And so we actually think we have a high quality system that is currently under strain. And I think one of the things that we've really noticed in terms of spending efficiency is that as these tracking measures for outcomes and performance become more and more pinpointed, there's a massive growth in, for example, resources going into administration, and a significant shrinkage in the resources going into faculty, into full-time faculty hiring, which is honestly the base of our institutions. It's what happens in the classroom with students, and what happens when faculty have the resources to do the research that actually drives Ontario ahead, forward. So we really think those kinds of metrics measuring actually slows us down.
Ms. Franklin, sorry to interrupt. Ms. Franklin, final word to you, just on the same point. What do you think?
Well, there's no question we all have high-quality institutions. In fact, around the world, we're regarded exceptionally well in that way. But, it's not just government. People generally have higher and higher expectations of their public institutions. And certainly, as of 2007 and 2009, when we hit the recession in Ontario, what we saw from polling, parents, students, was a concern about whether or not their son or daughter was going to get the kind of education that would lead to a good job. And the feedback we were getting from poll after poll was very specific. I really need my son or daughter to have the opportunity of a good career at the end of their education. Students were asking us more and more about that. So I think the issue of outcomes and value for money is an evolving one, and a lot of it has to do with circumstance and context at a given time. So I don't blame the government for wanting to make sure that taxpayers' dollars are well spent, that parents and students feel that they're getting value for money, and that we keep ourselves always to a higher and higher standard. Whether we're doing great today, which I believe we are, we can always do better. It's important to always be monitoring that, because tax dollars are strained in all sorts of areas, not just post-secondary education. So I think that's an important principle. I mean, I certainly wouldn't support anything that would restrict freedom of speech on campuses, but in fact, I think this policy is doing the exact opposite. It's saying unequivocally that critical thinking, that the free exchange of ideas are important and critical to post-secondary institutions, and that is a value that we all subscribe to. So I think there's a good proposition there that should help people understand that freedom of speech is a critical value in post-secondary education.
All right, I have to leave it there, but thank you so much to both of you for your time. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Gillian Phillips and Linda Franklin.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.